Okay, so hello everyone. We'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which Monash University's 4 Australian campuses stand, and pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Many thanks for joining today's webinars. My name is Chong Cho. I'm the Director of the Center for Global Business at Monash University. Today's webinars are on food security in low-income countries affected by various disruptions such as the pandemic, climate change, and political instability. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Nazman Ratna from Lincoln University, New Zealand, who will moderate today's webinars. And our sincere thanks to today's speakers who will share their thoughts and time with us so generously. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Nazman.
Thank you, Professor Cho. This is my absolute pleasure and honor to be moderating this session. Food security in South Asia has been one of the areas I have worked on for a few years. And when it comes to the issues related with disruptions, so we are going to talk about 3 disruptions today. One is definitely climate change, one is political instability in Myanmar, and then the impact of COVID on women farmers in Nepal. So what I want all the participants to think about, South Asia has seen a lot of research done with related to food security, with related to vulnerability. But when we looked at the situation during COVID, we have seen immensely horrifying scenarios for the vulnerable population. So these 3 speakers that we have invited today are the ones that we have chosen who have worked very closely with the policymakers. So the 3 speakers today all are from Institute for Food Policy Research Institute, International Food Policy Research Institute. And our first speaker today is Claudia Ringler. Claudia is you have seen Claudia's short bio in your invitation. So I'm going to be very, very brief here. Claudia is the Deputy Division Director for IFRI's Environment and Production Technology Division. She is also the Deputy Director of the CGIAR Research Program on Water, Land, and Ecosystems. Claudia will talk about climate change and the implication for vulnerable populations. Then we have Dr. Muzna Alvi. Muzna also works in the same division. Muzna is going to talk about the impact on the women farmers in Nepal and India. And then we have Dr. Derek Headley. Derek is a senior research fellow in the Poverty, Health, and Nutrition Division in IFRI, where he has worked since 2008. Derek would present the impact on the food security in Myanmar after the political instability. So without further ado, I would ask Claudia to start her presentation. Just a bit of housekeeping. Please, when someone is speaking, keep your speaker on mute. And if you have any questions that you want to ask the presenter, you can send it via chat and Q&A. Thank you very much. Claudia.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction and also for the introduction to this event. So I'm really honored to participate and also together with my colleagues and to talk about this really crucial topic, the topic of disruption, multiple disruptions, and we'll hear about climate change, COVID, and political instability. And I think I can already, just from the grouping of these presentations, I would say that what we don't do enough is bringing these 3 topics together and actually looking at the joint implications for the vulnerability of poor populations in South Asia. So I think, as Nazmoon has already said, climate change is obviously a key disruptor to food security everywhere. But South Asia does play a key role due to its very high population density, already very high natural resource stresses, high food insecurity and malnutrition levels, and of course, high poverty levels. So that's why we're really particularly concerned about climate change impacts in South Asia. But climate change is clearly a global phenomenon, and clearly everyone is affected everywhere. Really, no one is excluded from adverse impacts from climate change. So this picture just shows increase. So that's increase in global annual surface temperature. And the picture, I think, is quite straightforward. It's really getting hotter everywhere and all the time. And so basically, this is a snapshot that ends in 2020, so it's quite recent. And compared to just the 1850 to 1900 period, we have seen a 1.25 centigrade increase in temperature. And if you just look at a more recent period, just compared to 1981 to 2010, we've seen an increase in 0.6 degrees. It doesn't seem like much, but averages hide what the actual extremes are. So we see many more heat stress related deaths, especially in urban areas, but also heat stress affecting agriculture productivity, and lots of unreported impacts from heat stress, like poultry farms where all the animals are dying. I mean, the impacts are really quite dramatic. Despite this, we know we're heating up and the consequences are stark, but we have huge uncertainty. We really don't know what all of the other impacts are. And for example, we have huge floods right now in Germany, and there's this question, is it really part of climate change or not? So we do see not only heat stress, we do not only see floods and droughts, but there are also sandstorms, typhoons, fires. So as you've probably also seen in the news, a lot of areas are burning up. And of course, Australia is right in the middle of these adverse impacts. Particular interest in South Asia is what does the climate change do to the summer monsoon, which is essential for food production in the region. And it has been very difficult to understand the impact of climate change on the monsoon. It still is very difficult to fully understand the interactions. But I think more and more the literature seems to crystallize and suggest that we actually see an increase in mean rainfall from climate change impacts on the monsoon. So that sounds like a potentially positive impact from climate change, because we know that South Asia is highly water scarce. It's really the most water stressed area in terms of stresses on groundwater resources, especially the northwestern area. We know that rural water security is extremely bad, water pollution is extremely high. So is this actually a positive news? And to some extent, the increased precipitation as a result of climate change is positive news, because there has been some research that has tried to look at the impacts of increased precipitation from the monsoon on groundwater depletion. So does it, for example, take care of the problem in northwestern India? Because the increase from the monsoon rain is expected to come down to some quite large extent in that region. But the answer is really quite mixed. So climate change can reduce, but not really eliminate the very severe groundwater depletion trends that we have seen in that region. So it makes a little bit of a dent. At the same time, we know that the way that water comes down, it'll come down in floods, far too concentrated to really replenish resources, and it will run off. And of course, there will be huge damage from these much more concentrated precipitation events. At the same time, we do see, despite the increased projections and predictions for rainfall as a result of the monsoon, as a result of climate change for the monsoon, we also see a drying out of southwestern India. So it's really, everything is a mixed picture. So maybe some small relief for groundwater depletion, but all in all, it's still a very negative event from groundwater. So what does climate change, and here really I'm only referring to long-term change in precipitation temperature, what does it do to food production? What does it do to food security? Why is it a disruptor? So what this slide shows now for a neighbor of India, Bangladesh, is the percentage change in yields due to these long-term average changes. And what you can see here across a series of climate change scenarios, we see pretty much almost only negative yield yield changes for maize, for wheat, for rice. Obviously, rice is particularly important in Bangladesh, but also for example, groundnuts and sugarcane. So the overall impact from climate change on yields and thus on food production, for the example of Bangladesh, but globally, the average impact is negative. And so what does that do? These negative yield impacts affect food prices, it affects food affordability, and every time when food prices go up, poorer consumers are most affected, and poorer consumers will revert to more basic staple cereals that provide more calories for the prices. I mean, the price calorie ratio is much more positive. So what we will see is a reduction in nutrition security and a reduction in diversity of diets as a result of climate change. And in fact, we are already seeing that. And we have seen that also in past food price increases. And again, I think also what Nazmur has been trying to say, you know, different people will be affected differently. We are all affected by climate change, but the impact will be much more severe for people who just don't have the resources, you know, to afford more expensive diets. And so what can countries do? What should countries do? I just pasted here some steps from the Bangladesh's first nationally determined contribution document to the UNFCCC. And what you can see here, really definitely an interest to focus on rice, which obviously is the key crop. Ways to both adapt to climate change, to less water resources, but also hopefully to reduce emissions through this alternative wetting and drying technology that of course only works if you have very good water control. Increased mechanization in agriculture to reduce cattle, which of course is famous for emissions. Coastal mangrove plantations, reforestation, etc., some forestry. So, I mean, those are all typical policies to address climate change impacts, but they're really not very specific. And the interim 2020 NDC doesn't actually mention climate, doesn't mention agriculture. Obviously, it mentions climate change. So basically, we need to do a lot better. So then, in turn, what are the implications of higher food prices, lower food production on the number of food insecure people or people at risk of food insecurity? And this is just one projection using one climate change scenario. And what we can see here for South Asia, projected increase in about 9 million people with in a climate change scenario compared to a no climate change scenario under the SSP2 medium kind of shared socioeconomic pathway. So that doesn't look that dramatic, especially compared to Sub-Saharan Africa, where we project 46 million more people being food insecure compared to 690 million people in 2019. And in fact, the latest projections from and estimates from the FAO and other UN colleagues is about 800 million people in 2020 as a result of COVID-19, which we'll hear about shortly. So while that number of 9 million didn't sound that bad, this graph actually suggests that the variation of changes in food insecurity in South Asia and the South Asia region is very, very large. And the 9 million people could be 100 million people incremental increase in food insecurity compared to the no climate change scenario if we combine other shared socioeconomic pathways and other climate scenarios. So there's really a huge uncertainty in terms of the actual outcomes. Plus, this modeling only looks at the long-term average changes in temperature and precipitation, doesn't consider glacier melt and sea level rise and emerging pests and diseases that are also very clearly linked with climate change. So basically, this is a very, very conservative scenario. So my last slide, what should and could South Asia do? Really, there are innumerable solutions. There are many, many opportunities, also many challenges. But for sure, it's important to focus on much more targeted solutions, not broad brush investments, because the impacts are quite specific. I mentioned there's huge uncertainty, but we do know we do know pretty much which areas are drying faster, where are flood risks much higher. So we have much more data nowadays. So it's really important to, sit at the drawing board and just reconsider, don't focus on incremental change, reconsider some fundamental investments, such as, for example, sugarcane. South Asia is the only region in the world where sugarcane is grown to a very large extent in semi-arid areas. Is this the right policy under climate change, to grow sugarcane with groundwater? So that I would put a big question mark right there. This is one of the largest water users in India, for example. Should we export rice from already water scarce areas in Pakistan? I would put a very strong question mark right there. It's also important to review overall water storage and water productivity measures and technologies, given these growing extreme events. The solar strategies that South Asia has been pursuing is laudable, but most likely the way the subsidies are being, the subsidy policy has not been very equitable. So I think a lot could be done there. It's also important to strengthen digital extension advice. So again, that actually is also part mixed message that combines climate change threats and COVID-19 challenges. So trying to reach farmer better, and especially women farmers better, with extension advice is an area that increased focus should be put towards. Finally, we know that a lot of very poor people will absolutely not be able to afford affordable foods because of climate change. We already have seen it under COVID-19. So we do need much better, much more targeted food safety nets. And we know that governments can only do this to some extent. So we need local communities, local self-help groups and NGOs to really cover that last mile to reach vulnerable people. And finally, and last, again, just looking at this picture, I felt it was important to also reconsider labor use in agriculture. And we know that heat stress affects agriculture sector more than any other sector, and just almost no work has been done on that. So that's, if there are students in the audience, I hope those might be some of the topics you could be looking into to help address the key disruption of food security in South Asia, which is climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia, for your insightful presentations. I think the main takeaway from me would be, as South Asia has progressed economically, more and more focus was beginning to start to look into nutrition security. And your presentation highlights that we are actually going backward in a way because of the crisis that we have currently, COVID-19. And one of the marginalized groups that we have seen has been affected most, actually all over the world, irrespective of the country, but the vulnerability is much higher for women who are in the rural areas of South Asia. So our presentation by Dr. Alvi would now bring in the impact of COVID-19 for women farmers in India and Nepal. Musna, over to you.
Thank you, Nazmun. Am I audible?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much to Monash for giving us the opportunity to present our work. And this is joint work with my colleagues, Claudia Ringler, Ruth Mainzendick, Prapti Barua, and Shweta Gupta. And the presentation I'm making today draws from a series of phone surveys that we've been conducting in India and Nepal to understand gendered impacts of COVID-19 among poor and vulnerable groups. I want to quickly acknowledge our donors, BMZ in India and USAID in Nepal. And this study was implemented in partnership with Self-Employed Women's Association, or SEVA, and All India Disaster Mitigation Institute in India, and the Institute for Integrated Development Studies, IIDS, in Nepal. So just to talk briefly about the COVID and study timeline in both countries, much like the rest of the world, very strict lockdowns were imposed in both countries towards the end of March, and restrictions were gradually relaxed in India since June and in Nepal around July. For agriculture, the restrictions began to be eased much earlier in both countries as it came under an essential services sector. And that's important because most of our sample is comprised of agricultural laborers and workers. The first round of our survey was implemented in June in India and July in Nepal, round 2 in August and September, and round 3 in early December in both countries. I'll focus on sort of findings from the first 3 rounds, although we do have data from the 4th round as well, and the 5th round is in the field as we speak. But the 3rd round is around the time when lockdown restrictions were eased to a great extent in both countries, and the incidence of new COVID cases was relatively low. It was the end of the first quote unquote peak in the region, but there were still significant economic shocks, and people were still sort of suffering from the repercussions of the economic shocks experienced earlier due to the lockdowns. The study was carried out among rural households in 9 districts in rural and urban households in 9 districts in Gujarat, which is a state in the western part of India, and 4 municipalities in Dang, which is a district located in midwestern Nepal, bordering India. I would like to point out a caveat that the samples in both the countries are not nationally or regionally representative, since it was carried out only in selected districts and sampled purposively. So in India, our sample included only women who were members of the Self-Employed Women's Association, and was selected using random sampling from a master list of members that we obtained from SEVA. So we covered more than 600 respondents in the first round with some attrition over subsequent rounds. The study sample in Nepal was drawn again from a large representative household listing that we had done in early 2020 in person for what was supposed to be an RCT on video-based ag extension, and that had to be modified to become an RCT on phone-based ag extension due to COVID. And so a subsample of that larger RCT sample formed our sort of respondents for this gendered survey. So we have about 530 female respondents and about 230 male respondents from Nepal. And the men and women come from different households. So we're not serving husbands and wives in the same households. They're from different households. So we are serving agriculture decision makers in each of these maize growing households. Before I move on to the results, I wanted to sort of quickly touch upon some of the methodological issues. And sort of being a business school, I was hoping that this would be of interest to people who are out there collecting data. The image, and several of you must have come across some iterations of this image, looking at sort of huge gender divide in phone ownership, which is persistent across the world, but in no other place is it as stark as it is in South Asia. So half the unconnected women in the world live in this region. And we kind of end the conversation often at sort of the gender divide in phone ownership, but it doesn't just end there. There are important intersectionalities to consider. So we know from previous large-scale household survey data in India that disadvantaged ethnic groups in India, for example, like Dalits, tribals, and religious minorities like Muslims, and women and children from these groups are less likely to have access to mobile and computer technology, and that makes everything from accessing information to accessing online and remote learning a big challenge. And that also means that when we are doing phone surveys, such as the results that I'm going to be talking about, we're also not able to adequately reach people from these disadvantaged groups. On a more micro side is the issue of course, intra-household disparity in phone access. So in both countries, we found that many women had to use their husband's or their son's phone, so it was harder to get women on the phone to answer these surveys. A lot of women's phones became inactive between rounds, and on sort of probing some more, we found out that it's often women's phones are sort of low on the priority of our household budgets. And so when budgets are already stretched due to economic shocks, those are one of the first things to be cut from the household budgets. And so there's little we can do as researchers in terms of improving access to phones, but when analyzing data, I think it's important to acknowledge the sample from which the information is obtained is missing out on those who are the most vulnerable and disadvantaged. One of the other big issues that emerged in operationalizing the survey was how to ensure respondent privacy when administering these surveys. And from our end, of course, we always make provisions for storing data safely. But what do you do when women themselves aren't in a safe space to answer questions? So before we started the SEVA survey, which is one of the first surveys that we did at phone surveys that we did early in the pandemic, SEVA informed us that as they were recruiting women for our survey, so when they were giving us, making that master list of their members, they found out that a lot of women were answering their phone on speaker, and this was often because their husbands or in-laws were asking them to put their phone on speaker. And this was important information for us to know beforehand, because we were planning to ask what we considered sensitive questions on conflict, intra-household conflict and violence, and simply just asking women if they were in a private space wasn't going to be enough if someone was listening in. So we decided to add a question in our survey to gauge if the phone was on speaker, and we did this at the beginning and again before the conflict module that was asked at the end. And because we couldn't ask this directly, we sort of included a more indirect way of asking whether the phone was on speaker or not. And in most of the subsequent surveys we have done since then in the South Asia region as well as in Africa, we have included some form of this question. Not unsurprisingly, we have found widespread speakerphone use in India. So nearly 2/3 of the women had their phone on speaker in India, nearly half in Nepal in the first round. And we found high speakerphone use even in other countries in Africa where we've done our survey. The interesting thing is that when women's speakerphone use is high, men's speakerphone use is also high. So I think some of this is also being driven by sort of cultural use of speakerphone in certain areas and not in certain areas, but consistently always women's use of speakerphone has always been significantly higher than it has been of men's within the same country. And also, I wouldn't spend too much time on it, but we also, in sort of digging through the data a little bit more, find that use of speakerphone also affects how women respond to certain questions. But I guess that's the subject of another presentation. So that's something to keep in mind, that sort of breaches in privacy could also affect the kind of responses you get. So in India, agriculture was the primary occupation for a majority of the women that we surveyed and their spouses, but also a considerable proportion of our sample also worked as vendors and wage laborers, particularly in urban areas. And this is because we wanted a more representative sample of SEVA members, and SEVA members are spread kind of widely in rural and urban areas. So in urban areas, they work mostly as construction workers, laborers, or as vegetable vendors and small business vendors. In Nepal, on the other hand, again, by design, agriculture was the primary occupation for more than 85% women, slightly lower share of, and a slightly lower for men. And we find a lot of women had spouses who were engaged in the non-farm sector as casual laborers or wage earners. And I think this is driven primarily by women whose husbands were migrants and sort of not present in the household. So moving right into the challenges that we found women faced due to COVID-19. In both countries, nearly identical number of people reported having income loss. This figure that I'm showing you is for India, but we found about 85% of respondents in both the countries in the first round reported that they had experienced income loss as a result of the lockdown. And this over time has reduced to about 45% in both countries by round 3 and even lower by round 4, which was conducted just before the recent COVID wave in the two countries. And as we are collecting data in the 5th round, we expect that some of these sort of negative impacts would have re-emerged due to, again, the stricter lockdowns that were imposed after and during the second wave. So unlike Nepal, where our respondents are predominantly farmers, in Gujarat, we can see how results vary for those who are from different occupations, and we find significant heterogeneity. So people who were employed in urban areas where the brunt of the lockdown was much more severe, and where lockdown was enforced more strictly, we find more significant impacts on income loss. So, and this is consistent with findings from other parts of the country where rapid phone surveys and rapid surveys right after the lockdown had showed that people who were engaged in agriculture-related work were somewhat cushioned from the most severe kind of impacts of the lockdown. And even in our own data, we see that when, for example, when we surveyed dairy farmers, we found that the amount of milk that they sold and the price of the milk that they sold hadn't changed much after the lockdown, but they did shift away from their customer base. So earlier they were selling more to dairy cooperatives, they were the major buyers. They started doing more individual sales. So there was a shift in who bought it, but not so much in the prices that they got for their produce. And the disproportionate impact on urban workers has persisted across rounds, whereas income for those who are in agriculture seems to have recovered somewhat. We also asked questions on what are the coping mechanisms used in both countries, and we found very high reliance on borrowing and selling of assets, and very little kind of access to transfers from the government. So only about 15% of households in India said they had received transfers from the government, and much fewer in Nepal, actually just 5%. And we also find that in Nepal, at least, and this could be driven by who controls resources, men were much more likely to sell assets as a way of coping with income loss, women much more likely to borrow as a coping mechanism. And that, like I said, could be driven by who controls what kind of resources. So moving into sort of the main issue that we are interested in, Claudia already spoke about what our projections are about the number of people, how that's going to be, the number of people who are going to be suffering from hunger in 2020 and in 2021. And we also find sort of significant food insecurity issues in India, especially. So we have a high proportion of respondents in India who are worried about not having enough food. And this has persisted across rounds. So what I'm showing you right now is round 3, which means that it was higher in round 1 and 2. In Nepal, this figure was higher in the earlier stages of the lockdown. In fact, it got worse in the second round because the second round was conducted in an agriculture off-season. But following maize and paddy harvest, which happened around the third round of our survey, a considerably lesser proportion of respondents expressed being worried about food or having to change their food habits to eating unhealthy food or not nutritious food due to not having access to better quality food. And in India, again, I just want to sort of reiterate that we see patterns similar to what we saw in income loss, so that food insecurity was lower among agricultural households and was highest among urban vendors and urban laborers, driven in no doubt by deep and persistent income loss. We also wanted to measure not just whether they had food or not, but whether they were eating sort of a diverse diet or whether women had access to a diverse diet or not. So we also calculated minimum dietary diversity for women based on a 24-hour recall period. So we asked questions whether they've consumed food from 10 different food groups, and women who consumed at least 5 food groups in the last 24 hours are considered to have achieved minimally adequate dietary diversity. And we find that, and again, this is round 3, so things have gotten a little bit better by round 3, is much worse in rounds 1 and 2. Dietary diversity in India was still on the lower side, with less than 20% of the women achieving minimally adequate diet. On the other hand, in Nepal, this was around 68%. I also wanted to kind of quickly touch on water security as well. And we find that, again, in India, households face issues of water security at a much higher rate as compared to Nepal. And mostly this was in the form of not having sufficient water for household needs. I also want you to kind of focus on a little bit on the last graph that is in this figure, which looks at whether people had to reduce the frequency of washing hands due to inability to access water. And we find that in India, even till the third round, we had about 20% households that shared that they had to go without washing their hands sometimes. And this is worrying because in the context of COVID, at least, the messaging up until even late last year was that, wash your hands frequently, and especially after, going out. And so the fact that there was still a significant proportion of people who could not wash their hands as much as they would have liked because of not being able to access water is worrying. We also find that a lot of people reported that because kids were at home, people were at home, not going out because of mobility restrictions, that their water consumption for household purposes had increased due to COVID, which was an additional expense on already sort of overstretched household budgets. Another important issue that that we wanted to study was migration and its impact of COVID on migration. In Gujarat, migration is typically low. It's a net migrant receiving state, and that was reflected in our sample as well. But in Nepal, on the other hand, especially in the district we surveyed, there was large out migration. So more than 44% of households in our sample had long-term migrants from their household at any time during the past year, and a majority of them were men, about 93%. And nearly a third of these households reported return migration due to the lockdown. So they said that the migrants had returned after the lockdown. And of the remaining sort of 67% households where family members were still living outside, only 40% continued to receive remittances. And this was much lower than, and it wasn't just that whether they received remittances or not, the amount they received was also much less than before, as you can see from the figure. We also find that by round 3, return migration in Nepal had increased. So from 33% of households, now we had about 40% households who said that their migrants had returned due to COVID. But interestingly enough, a lot of these migrants had also re-migrated back to either the same places where they were working before or to new places. And when we asked why, from those who hadn't returned, when we asked why they hadn't returned, fear of COVID was cited as the main reason for not returning in about 40% of the sample. And non-availability of jobs, both the old jobs that they had before, as well as any new jobs in the areas in which they would have liked to migrate, was the next most important reason. And very few people said that they had found employment locally and were not planning to return. We also find, we would have sort of expected that as a result of shocks to income and sort of uncertainty about COVID, that would have induced people to diversify, and sort of households that had previously not sent any migrants would have sent sort of for the first time migrants to other regions within the country and outside. But we find new migration to be very low in just about 3 or 4% of the households, and it was again concentrated only among men. So, and this is the last sort of section of my slide, and I wanted to spend some time on it because as we are learning more about the implications of the pandemic, we realize that it has significantly altered people's life. And while the health and economic costs of the COVID pandemic and lockdown have now been extensively documented, there's much less evidence on how the pandemic has impacted mental health and well-being, and especially in sort of rural context, and how negative health and economic shocks have exacerbated these impacts on mental health. So acknowledging this need for evidence, we introduced a module in the third round of our survey to assess the level of depression among study participants in both India and Nepal. And we administered the Center of Epidemiologic Studies Depression Scale, or CEST. So these are about 20 questions or statements about how often they experience different indicators of stress and depression in the week preceding the survey. And responses are scored between 0 to 3 for every question. So the possible range is 0 to 60, with higher scores indicating the presence of more depressive symptoms. And sort of the literature says that an individual is said to be suffering from probable depression if their score is 16 or above. If we use this cutoff, we find that about 38% of women in India and around 23% women in Nepal were suffering from depressive symptoms or probable depression. And we observe that women were, in Nepal, we observe that women are twice as likely to be depressed than men. So we're just beginning to sort of dig into this data in detail, but one of the first things we wanted to look at was how the incidence of depression is related to a host of indicators, including experiences of income loss, food and water insecurity, whether you were able to eat an adequately diverse diet or not, your experience of health shocks sort of around the survey time, and our main outcome variable is whether an individual was categorized as being depressed or not. And we also tried to see whether your score itself is affected by so not just an indicator variable for whether you're above 16 or not, but how the score itself, because 16 is a somewhat arbitrary cutoff. So whether the score itself is affected by all of these kind of variables. And then again, we're obviously interested in the Nepal context of whether the determinants for men and women are different. So I'll quickly touch upon those. So comparing women from both countries, we see that there are certain predictors that are common for both the countries. So married women have lower odds of being depressed, but women who experience food and water insecurity in both countries are more likely to be to have a score that's about 16. In India, we find women from higher caste households had higher odds of being depressed, and women from economically better off households also had higher odds of being depressed. Whereas women who were who worked as vegetable vendors had higher odds of being depressed, again, no doubt linked to health and economic shocks. In Nepal, we find women who had suffered income loss or health shocks were more likely to be depressed. In comparing in Nepal men and women, we find that, again, experience of health shock, food insecurity, and water insecurity were the 3 determinants that were common to both men and women. But in the case of men, we find that men who were belonging to more privileged caste groups, such as Brahmins and Kshetris, had higher odds of being depressed as compared to those belonging to the Janjati tribes, which are the tribals. Men from economically better off households in Nepal had lower odds of suffering from depression. And this is opposite to what we observed it for women in India. We also find that men who are in casual labor and salaried jobs, again, these are jobs that were more likely to be affected by the lockdown, had significantly higher odds of being depressed. And our sort of somewhat preliminary hypothesis is that men's emotional well-being seems to be closely linked to their financial condition. And this is perhaps because in South Asia, at least, conventional gender roles expect men to be the primary breadwinner. And so financial setbacks are a big shock to them. Maybe a bigger shock as compared to women. And as we understand, non-farm sector jobs were severely affected due to the lockdown, which may have decreased emotional well-being among men and triggered depression among those who sort of suffered these economic shocks. And we find, and among women, we find that household income loss increased the odds of depression, while achieving minimally adequate diet and being married reduced the odds of depression. So just quickly on sort of, I don't want to talk about what we should do in some of the larger context, but a little bit about addressing mental health in rural context. We understand that factors such as income shock and food insecurity, etc., have an impact on individual mental health. And now with the second wave and what looks like a possible third wave of infections, these negative impacts are only going to get exacerbated. So there's a strong need to account for mental health and well-being as part of sort of crisis relief and rehabilitation. And one of the first steps would be to address the stigma that is associated with mental health, especially in South Asia, and improving access to mental health resources in rural areas, especially among women. As researchers, I think we need better data to be able to address this issue better. So, and also to acknowledge that men and women, as well as people in different contexts, experience shock and stressors differently. And for that, we do need more gender disaggregated data for better insights. And lastly, something which we all have sort of talked about and hopefully we'll talk about during the course of this sort of discussion is the need for better social protection measures that will reduce the intensity of negative impacts and improve resilience to build stronger, more resilient communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Musna, for your very fascinating presentation. My biggest takeaway would be how we see that despite having better economic indicators in India, the percentage of people who are worrying about not having enough food was much higher than what you saw in Nepal. And also the one that you mentioned, that the water security issues were quite concerning as well. So the reduction in the use of, reduction in the frequency of washing your hands were much higher in India. But on top of everything, the point you make about the emotional well-being, I think this is an area a lot of the South Asian context has shied away to some extent, especially how it intersects with the other crises that we're talking about. And I think it's also important to acknowledge how interdisciplinary work could be really, really powerful to address this intersectionality. And that brings me to the next presenter, Derek Headley. And Derek is going to talk about the impact on food security in Myanmar. And as we know that Myanmar is facing overlapping crises. In addition to COVID, they are facing the political instability and what Derek is going to talk about how the urban population had been facing the implications of COVID-19 and political instability. Derek, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you for having me. It's really nice to join this seminar. Melbourne's actually my hometown, but I haven't been there in a really long time. So it's sort of nice to be there virtually. So I'm going to talk about the Rural and Urban Food Security Survey called RUFS, with recent phone survey evidence from May 2021. Actually, we have a survey that's just finished in July, but that data is not fully processed yet. So I'll just touch on it in brief, but this is a panel survey that's been running since June 2020. So we're currently in our 8th round. And so this is part of an activity for the Myanmar Agricultural Policy Support activity that's led by IFPRI, but in conjunction with Michigan State University, and we're funded by USAID and the Livelihoods and Food Security Fund, or LIFT. But this survey is also implemented with IPA in Myanmar, as well as some collaborators from the University of Michigan. So just a quick overview of the situation in Myanmar. I'm sure many people have been following what's going on in the news, but some further background. Of course, Myanmar sort of emerged with a sort of partial democratization from roughly sort of 2010 onwards, after many, many decades of military rule and economic and political isolation. As I said, that democratization was really partial. There was still a very strong role for the military in the economy and in politics as well. But prior to COVID-19, the country was experiencing very high rates of economic growth, high rates of of foreign investment, and seemed to be on a really good economic footing. But there were, of course, major economic disruptions due to COVID-19 in 2020. I think the extent of these disruptions was underestimated by the government and the World Bank, perhaps partly just as a sort of matter of accounting, due to the financial year and having very strong growth early in the year. But I think initially there was really an underestimation of how severe the economic consequences in Myanmar were. And then, of course, in February 1st, 2021, just as the new democratic parliament was due to take over, the military stepped in with a coup d'etat and has taken over, and of course, arrested many democratically elected leaders. That resulted in wide-scale protests and strikes, very wide scale. And in terms of the economic impacts, one of the main symptoms was an almost complete financial system collapse. So banks are really not functioning normally. People are lining up for hours on end to get cash. Credit systems are broken down, microfinance is broken down. So yeah, that's been a major problem for the economy since February 1st. But really, we've seen major disruptions in almost every sector, including basic government services as well. So I think one of the ways to sort of immediately see how severe the economic impacts are in Myanmar is to look at the Google Stay-at-Home Index. So this is actually the Google Residential Mobility Index that Google's been publishing, freely available since the start of the pandemic. And of course, higher values here mean people are staying at home more than usual compared to a pre-COVID baseline. And in fact, this Google index has been shown to be, in fact, a study I did earlier in the year shown to be a very strong predictor of macroeconomic performance across countries, as well as poverty dynamics in Myanmar. And it's also widely used in macroeconomic projections by IFPRI, the World Bank, IMF, and others. And so what you can see here is that Myanmar was basically like all countries in March and April 2020. It went into quite a strict lockdown. Mobility declined really sharply in April 2020. But then there were very few cases in Myanmar, and you see people started going out more, and you saw fewer people staying at home. That continued until about September, when Myanmar had its first proper wave, possibly imported cases from Myanmar, from India, where it has a very porous border. And COVID cases really took off in September, October, November, and mobility really declined. People stayed at home a lot more. And that recovery was really slow, but by January 2021, we started to see businesses opening up, consumers going out more. And then you can see this trough here in about week 4 or 5 in February 2021, when we had the military coup, and then the mobility declines again. And so people are staying at home more and more. Things have improved a little bit since then, but actually Myanmar in the last few weeks, like many other Asian countries, has seen rapidly rising COVID-19 cases. So it really is a perfect storm. And in fact, in rural areas, we've also seen issues with drought. So as Claudia mentioned, this is really a three-way storm in Myanmar. So we knew that the COVID shock alone, the economic shock, was going to be really severe. So we started a survey in June 2020, but also asked some retrospective questions about incomes prior to COVID-19, so incomes in January 2020. But a little bit about our sample first. Our respondents are pretty unique. You might say they're nutritionally vulnerable households because they're all either mothers of young children from urban Yangon or the rural dry zone. The urban sample, in fact, were women who were pregnant in January 2020. So they were giving birth throughout the year during COVID-19. And the rural sample had been beneficiaries of a maternal and child cash transfer program in previous years. So they also had young children. We have 7 rounds, or at least I'm reporting on 7 rounds. We've just finished an 8th, starting in June 2020, and then we followed households every month until sort of November, December 2020. And then, of course, we had the political disruptions, but we managed to field a survey in May 2021, a couple of months after the military takeover. The target has always been 2,000 respondents per round, balanced between these rural and urban samples, so about 1,000 each. It's an unbalanced panel in that mothers drop in and out. Obviously, a lot of, as I mentioned in the urban sample, a lot of mothers were giving birth, so they had a very good excuse to miss at least 1 or 2 rounds, but many of them actually returned. But in May 2021, we did see for the first time significant attrition, especially in the urban sample. So we lost about 20% of the sample in Yangon, and that's not surprising. There was a lot of disruption, as I'll show you, a lot of migration, and also a lot of disruption to telecommunications as well. So yes, almost 20% of those urban mothers couldn't be reached in May, and they were replaced by new samples, although I sometimes report statistics for a panel of households rather than that replacement sample. But it's worth noting here potential for selection bias. It's possible that those non-respondents are more likely to have moved or more likely to have suffered severe shocks. And I should also add that the Yangon sample now includes some respondents who have actually left Yangon. So I'm going to report some results now for migrants. We used to report results just as urban and rural, but now I'm going to report results for recent migrants as well. So I'm just going to report on a few key results. First, we just asked respondents in May, what were the 3 main impacts of political instability? Only 14% reported no impact. What's really striking is that although there was a lot of households feeling some sense of political insecurity, the economic impacts were really wide felt. 51% cited job or income losses. 29% feared losing income in the near future. 31% cited food supply problems. And then these political factors also come in. A high share feel unsafe, about 38%, and 10% fear family members getting hurt or detained. There are some differences across rural and urban areas, but those are basically common to both samples. A really striking finding in May, we asked a question, are you still residing in the same dwelling as December 2020? And we saw very high rates of migration out of Yangon in particular, where there are a lot of protests and also violence. So 21% of the sample had moved since December 2020. Only 4% of rural households moved. Physical security was the most commonly cited reason, and then a series of economic reasons. And 46% of urban migrants moved to rural areas and 30% moved to other urban areas. And around 50% of urban migrants said they had left permanently or were going to leave for longer than 6 months. But actually, in our most recent round, we found a large number, about 4 out of 5, 83%, actually returning to their original township, mostly in Yangon. So actually, we've already seen quite a bit of return migration. A third key result is we saw really high job losses in Yangon and the dry zone. This was a question we'd only asked since August 2020. And you'll see during the worst months of the COVID wave that really hit in September, October, November 2020, we saw lots of respondents saying they'd lost a job and not been able to find a new job or only been able to find casual work. So that peaked at around 22% in September 2020. But as of May, 25% of households in Yangon reported a job loss in the past month. So really striking job losses. And for the first time also, we started to see quite high job losses in the rural sample. That had always been below 10%, but as of May, that had hit 13%. And very few of the newly unemployed were able to find even casual work. However, a second component of that is that we split the sample here between households that stayed in Yangon and households that had moved since December 2020. And what we see is that, yeah, there's actually still very high unemployment among those who'd stayed in Yangon, 27% here, but among those who'd moved, it's 43%. So of course, we don't know the causality there. Many households may have moved because they were having trouble finding a job, but many households might have given up a job just to move. But we do see that even in November, December, those households that were going to move were already struggling with employment. So we do think some of the causality comes from unemployment causing migration. And we still see that even among the returned migrants, they're still more likely to be unemployed even when they've come back to Yangon. So a fourth key result. So unlike many other phone surveys, we tried to measure income. We just asked people to estimate income in the past month. We think it's clearly measured with error, but it also has tracked the course of the pandemic quite well. And then we use that income measure to calculate income per capita. And we define poverty as income per capita less than 890 kyat per day. So that's equivalent to the $1.90 poverty line in PPP dollars. So this is obviously not comparable to the expenditure-based poverty measure that's normally reported by the Myanmar government and the World Bank. And in earlier rounds, we also asked respondents to estimate income in January 2020 prior to COVID. And here, the really striking story is that 2020 saw dramatic increases in poverty, especially in urban areas. So I think that was referred to in some other phone surveys. But from January to June, for example, in the Yangon sample, in January 2020, only about 7% of Yangon households were income poor, but that had gone up to 36% by June. Then things got a little bit better in July and August, but when this first real wave of COVID cases hit in September, we see income-based poverty going up to 67% in both urban and rural areas. Again, splitting the sample, the Yangon sample up into those who not moved since December, we see that poverty is sort of stable between November and May, just moves from 46 to 47%. But for recent migrants, about 48% of those were income poor in November, but that's gone up to 63%. So that migration, either it's, those are households that were really struggling to find work in Yangon, or the act of moving itself has been very difficult, and they haven't been able to find income earning activities in rural areas or in other urban centers. So quite a dramatic story on poverty in Myanmar, and I think that's consistent with the Google mobility data that I showed you earlier, where we see really dramatic economic disruption in Myanmar. So the fifth key result, we see quite striking shifts in coping strategies. All along, we've seen that reducing non-food consumption is very common, as well as borrowing. Using cash savings has been common, especially among slightly better off households, but that's been trending downwards. So that's that sort of turquoise line there. And you can see that in September 2020, about 30% of households were using cash savings. But every month since, that's really been trending downwards, suggesting that maybe households are just exhausting their ability to continue using cash savings to cope with income losses. And then maybe the most disturbing result as of May 2021 is that really for the first time, we see that reducing food consumption is now quite common. In November, it was just 3.5% of households saying that they'd reduce food consumption to cope with income losses. That's now gone up to 15% as of May 2021. And then another result we see is an increase in getting help from relatives, and that's mostly the migrants. So that's mostly migrants moving back to rural areas or other urban centers and staying with relatives. And then we start to see also some tentative signs of selling more non-farm assets. We do know anecdotally that as the financial system broke down, people started purchasing gold and selling gold, and there was a lot of activity in the gold market, as well as pawning off household assets. Key result 6, strikingly, most food insecurity experience indicators asked just of women saw little change, although eating only a few kinds of foods increased in both samples. So most of these indicators, we asked all, I think, 7 FIES indicators. And here the main exception was just this eating only a few kinds of foods. This increased 6 points in the rural dry zone sample and 3 points in the original sort of Yangon sample, but it increased by 7 points among recent migrants. So we can see that those households are not only suffering significant income losses, they're also feeling more food insecure. So that's a slightly worrying sign for sure. And then just a quick update. We haven't fully analyzed the July 2021 results, but really one of the most striking results is that 83% of recent migrants actually returned to their townships as of July. So that's interesting. We haven't been able to dig yet into why that is, but we think that one of the issues has just been high unemployment in rural areas too. So it's been very difficult for migrants to find work in rural areas or in other urban centers. However, we still see that these both return and current migrants still have very high unemployment rates, and still say that, that there's lots of difficulties finding work. Poverty rates basically remained unchanged, so there's no improvement in poverty, and we don't see any major changes in food insecurity either. So in summary, many respondents cite physical insecurity as a key impact of the political instability that's going on, but even more cite income or job losses or fear of income losses. 21% of households in our Yangon sample moved between December 2020 and May 21. Around half of those were going to rural areas and 30% to urban areas in other states and regions. 25% of urban households lost a job in May, but it rose to 43% among recent migrants. Poverty rates are extremely high. They were high in late 2020, and they seem to be trending downwards in early 2020, but we see really no improvement and increases among some groups now. We also saw that households that left Yangon were 15 points more likely to be poor in May. And we see only modest increases in one specific indicator of food insecurity, although again, that's worse among recent migrants. Another striking fact I'll just touch on is that during COVID-19, the democratically elected government was doing reasonably well in giving cash transfers to a relatively large number of people. Around 50% of our sample reported receiving cash transfers in most months. That has basically disappeared. So it's down to only 1%. So social protection has basically disappeared since February 1st for a variety of reasons. So this really is a perfect storm in Myanmar. Okay, thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you, Derek, for your excellent presentation. Again, we see that the overlapping crisis in Myanmar has impacted the vulnerable population very strongly, as you have noted that from the survey in November to May, one of the coping strategy has been the reduction in food consumption, which is extremely alarming. And you have also highlighted how the very high rates of migration, they see that as a coping strategy. So I would expect to engage in that a bit more. But let's open up our session with questions. And so far, we have received questions from Jay Ananda. And Jay has the question for Claudia. So Jay says, salinity and flooding impacts have been exacerbated by climate change in Bangladesh. So his question is, any agency, IFRI or any other agency, has done any modeling with respect to climate change adaptation by rice farmers in Bangladesh? Claudia.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks for this question. So yes, it somehow turns out that we have done more climate change adaptation studies in Bangladesh than I think in any other country in South Asia, possibly more studies in Bangladesh than any other country. Why this is, I don't know, but I pasted a subset of the papers in the chat box, in the Q&A box. So we've done early studies looking at adaptation strategies for rice farmers, including changing planting dates, changing complementary agriculture inputs. We've done another study where we looked at various technologies such as salt, submergence tolerant varieties, salt tolerant varieties, heat and drought stress varieties. So we've actually done a lot of this work, and of course a lot of these technologies are changing, as we speak, and we hope they're still changing, because obviously just climate stresses are rapidly evolving, and a lot of these technologies, like submergence tolerance for 2 weeks, is not enough, right? So we need submergence tolerance for a much longer time frame. So yes, a lot of work has been done, but also we, more recently, we have done more work to see how we can actually move out of this too much rice farming in Bangladesh, because studies have clearly shown that the more rice you farm, a farmer with 3 consecutive rice crops, Boro, Aus, Aman, is the poorest farmer in our sample. So a farmer who does 2 rice crop and 1 other crop is better off, and a farmer who does 1 rice crop and 2 other crops is yet better off. So rice has not made farmers in Bangladesh rich. And so we've, not only that, so there's an income perspective, but there's obviously a nutrition perspective as well. And there's now actually a lot of work how we can use climate change adaptation to improve nutritional and diet diversity of farm households, because the big paradox that our farmers are nutritionally much worse off than the urban dwellers who have to buy all of their food. And so there is work on strengthening women's empowerment, how that supports crop diversification, to leave some of the rice production behind. And as I'm saying, we're not talking about entirely giving up on rice production, but just to much more diversify away from this rice monoculture. And of course, automatically with sea level rise, including some of the drying up, changing of flows into Bangladesh, and because of profitability, we see a lot more aquaculture and shrimp culture in the delta. That also can improve outcomes. I know there's also huge tension and conflicts around the way it's being done in Bangladesh, but that's also an automatic measure to reduce rice production in Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Before going to Musna and Derek and you to the same question, I would like to ask another question for Derek, which is raised by Abu Zafar Shahriar. Myanmar is currently experiencing a banking crisis. There is not enough cash in the economy. What are the likely impacts of the banking crisis on food security and well-being of the low-income households? Derek.
Yeah, it's difficult to assess. We've certainly been looking at that issue in rural areas where there's been a big breakdown in credit. So, people are just unwilling, input suppliers, for example, or mechanization service providers, etc. They're just unwilling to extend as much credit as was previously the case. Major disruptions in microfinance institutions as well. So we expect that could have knock-on effects on farmer productivity, on yields. That could cause some serious issues for food security in rural areas, potentially even urban areas. In urban areas, it's hard to envisage, how much disruption is being caused. I know our own staff, often spend hours per day lining up at banking machines to get cash. There's a system of sort of cash brokers that's also sort of evolved. So people are trying to find some ways to cope with it, but it's extremely disruptive. And until the financial sector gets remedied, it's very hard to see how the economy can get going again. I mean, I could have mentioned, but our most recent macroeconomic forecast for Myanmar project about a 10% decline in GDP or even a 20% decline. So the sort of 10% decline is what the World Bank has projected, but with rising COVID cases and continued disruptions throughout the rest of the year, the economy could contract by as much as 20%. And I think a major cause of that is financial instability, although there are plenty of other disruptions playing a role as well.
Thank you, Derek. While we wait for questions from the other audience members, I have a question for Musna and Derek and Claudia, so you each can answer separately. So in South Asia, migration is seen as a coping mechanism to address any sort of disasters, as you have seen in Myanmar, Derek, and also in your study, Musna. And it has been seen for a lot of the cases when we have natural disasters, people try to migrate from their place. How do you see the role of migration in buffering multiple crises? Now we are talking about overlapping crises here. So what would be your assessment, how effective migration has been given your knowledge and research? I would start with Musna.
Yeah, Nasman, thanks. That's a great question. And I think in Nepal, we certainly see that that is the case, right? That despite so many people returning back home, we see that a majority of them remigrated. So it certainly is a coping strategy, especially for countries like Nepal that are so hugely dependent. I mean, a big chunk of their national income is remittance based, and that's just remittance that's coming from outside. There are a lot of migrants who are migrating from rural to urban. Well, urban Nepal means Kathmandu. Then there is also a lot of undocumented migration that's happening to India, especially for women who are going, because Nepal has banned women from going to work as domestic workers in the Middle East from Nepal. We see a lot of migration happening through India. So women go to India because there's open porous border and then migrate through there. So certainly it is a coping mechanism. What we were surprised by, and we were not hoping, I guess we were expecting to see that even households that had previously not had migration would have sent migrants out because of the economic shock, and we didn't see that. So it was only among households that had previous experience with migration. They were the ones who was continuing to sort of either send the migrants back or sending more people from that same household as migrants. We didn't see any of the sort of non-migrant households sending any migrants, which could certainly be that either those households were relatively well off, so didn't need to send any migrants, or probably did not have any eligible men in the house, or women for that matter, to migrate. So that was something that was, so there wasn't a sort of a significant increase in the number of migrant households, but certainly we see sort of re-migration even among those who came back in the context when even the sort of threat from COVID hadn't completely gone back. So people are making sort of risky choices to migrate as a response to income loss and economic shock. Yeah.
I think I'm mute. Thank you, Musna. Derek, your observations.
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. We often see migration in response to shocks, often even from urban to rural areas. Well, and we saw that in Myanmar, but for a sort of, as I said, mixed reasons. So I think it was certainly partly people felt that it might be, they might feel more physically secure in rural areas. And they might be able to work on the farm. But, like South Asia in general, there's a real problem of landlessness as well in Myanmar. So not everybody has the opportunity to go back and sort of work on the family farm. And what we've heard anecdotally is that, yeah, there's been a lot of return migrants to rural areas, but there's just no jobs. There's just no work there as well. And then some villages are also facing political problems. By the local leadership or local military authorities as well, including extortion. So I think in many rural areas, the situation is just not economically good enough, strong enough to absorb those new migrants. And that's why we've seen some people sort of exiting for a while and then thinking, really, the situation is not sustainable. We might as well go back to Yangon and try things out. And we've heard of a few factories reopening in Yangon, but it's certainly not as vibrant as it was sort of 18 months ago.
Thank you, Derek. Claudia, your response?
Yeah, so definitely, migration is seen as something overall very positive in relation to climate change, because the key with climate change is to diversify out of a situation with very high climate risks. So, and rather, the migration doesn't necessarily have to be long distance. I think the main migration is probably out of agriculture. So I think households are trying to diversify to non-agricultural jobs that are less climate dependent, because you can't really move anywhere close and not be affected by the same climatic shocks. And sometimes even, urban areas works as long as you're then hopefully not engaged in agriculture. So yeah, it has been a long-term risk reduction strategy. And obviously, as Musna also said, sometimes it's also moving abroad, right? And we do in our household surveys, agriculture surveys, we find many households, many farm households where they look very unprofitable. It's like, why are you in agriculture business, or why are you still farming? Oh, because we have daughter, son, somewhere, someone who makes a steady income that really is the income source, and the farming is just happening, because for various other reasons, people don't want to give it up. So yes, it is, but at the same time, I think, so it's a strategy that will not go away. I think it'll strengthen. At the same time, of course, we've seen a lot of distress migration. So when we have like severe flooding or severe droughts, we know that migration I mean, that climate extreme event related migration has contributed to HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a clear pattern in terms of increases in cases and droughts. Because women, are forced to migrate and find other income sources, etc. So, or men, both. I mean, so basically lots of other adverse impacts as well. So it is a positive strategy, but of course, when it becomes a strategy out of desperation without prospects, for better income, then that's where I think we really need governments to come in. And it sounds like what Derek described is very much that. I mean, out of desperation, people left the city out of risk for their personal safety, left the city, and in the end find nothing and come back and are at a much lower level. So I mean, obviously Myanmar is not the right case to ask for government support right now, but obviously that's where we need international support, because we're moving into situations where these families might just never recover from the state, the stage, the risk and vulnerabilities they have moved down. So yeah, so it's really, I'd say, overall a positive strategy, and a strategy that will strengthen, and we should not fight it. But when it's very clear that it's distressed, that's when the international community has to intervene.
Thank you, Claudia. I just have one last question, kind of concluding question. All of you work, you do academic research, but when your academic research is very, very engaged with the policy framework for the countries that you work in. So do you think so far we have seen that with the COVID, a lot of the conversation in the literature has been about overlapping crises and how policy makers should address the crisis jointly rather than treating them separately? Do you think, given the situation that we face now, that we are into third wave in many of the developing countries, are there consensus among policy makers that it should be dealt as overlapping crisis, all this that we have talked about today? Any one of you can answer.
Maybe just a few words. I mean, yeah, it's obviously it's not a question we can answer it quite yet, but I mean, just from what I've seen in the media and so forth, when we, basically had one wave and people thought we were getting out of it, I think there was a very strong call for building back better, and definitely a very strong interest in focusing on climate change, adaptation, mitigation in the building back better, wave. So I think that, and actually a lot, we do see some of that, like in more high income countries, Europe, United States, the UK. I think they're starting to do these kind of investments that are conscious of climate, of the climate crisis and emergency. So that is still happening to some extent, but I think the rest of the world, I mean, just will not be able to build back better, because build back, they can't even do that. There's just no resources. And while, I think while there has been a strong original commitment, I think, from a lot of countries to help other countries, given that no country has actually fully come out of the COVID crisis. I mean, I think that's accurate to say, and actually we don't know where we're moving into, that this global support has waned. I think the crisis has just gone on too long, and while countries that can afford to address multiple issues at the same time will do so, but they will, I don't see a lot of global commitment right now to support the poorest countries, not the same level of original commitment and thought that it could be done. I think the economic impacts have been too large in countries, and the crisis has just gone on too long. So I do not see as much of a global support to address COVID and climate And obviously, the environmental emergency that we also face, and that's rapidly growing in terms of biodiversity and water and so forth. They're all interlinked, but I don't see a lot of these commitments. Of course, this is the year of commitments. We have UNFSS, the United Nations Food System Summit. We have COP26, but I don't see us moving a lot beyond commitments, verbal commitments. I don't see a lot of action. So I think it has just gone on too long. The severity of the crisis is too deep. And then many of the countries, where maybe help could come, it can't come because we have coups. I mean, we have many coups in the world, and there's probably more to come. The crises are just too deep. That's my assessment. Thank you.
Derek, would you like to add something?
Yeah, obviously the political situation in Myanmar looks intractable at the moment. But I think one of the lessons from last year in Myanmar and many other Asian countries is countries really need to be responsive and more efficient with their social protection. So these shocks came very suddenly, and countries were often sort of caught thinking, what do we do? Myanmar was sort of an extreme case. We really didn't have any large-scale social protection. So they were doing things like, well, let's just give people free electricity, highly regressive policy to start with. In other countries, like Indonesia, they did a little bit better, and they were, trying to sort of expand their list of beneficiaries and try and capture some of the new poor that were affected by these crises. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned about how we can respond better with social protection, better targeting, and also faster measures. Digital social protection, for example, probably has a big future. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. But yeah, like Claudia, I agree that COVID is going to have a long shadow. If you look at some of the economic projections that are coming out, by 2025, by 2030, the economies of many Asian countries are going to be, 10, 15, 20% smaller than they would have been without COVID. And we're looking at, maybe 15 to 20 million extra poor people, if not more. So it definitely has a long shadow. We're going to have to figure out how to reduce that shadow through, international commitments, but also domestic policies as well.
Thank you, Derek. That is quite alarming, and we have much more work to do. Musna, if you'd like to add.
No, I think I agree with what most of sort of Claudia and Derek have said in sort of needing to focus more on strengthening social protection. I think the other thing is that most of sort of our policies are designed to address idiosyncratic shocks that happen only in one region and not in others, whereas COVID showed us that there could be a lot of these sort of non-idiosyncratic shocks that happen globally at the same time, or at least regionally. And that's especially a challenge for, say, countries like Nepal that are so hugely dependent on their neighbors. For example, Nepal is completely reliant on India for its supply of inputs, both formally as well as through the sort of gray market and porous borders. And so I think maybe there is some role for sort of bilateral cooperation to play in these kind of things as we go on. I mean, this is not the last pandemic we will see in even maybe our lifetimes. And so we need to be prepared for, sort of shocks that affect entire regions at the same time, rather than just sort of certain parts of the country or just one country in isolation. So I think that's my big takeaway. What I have found, though, that sort of civil society organization, grassroots organization, as always, seem recognize the issue much better than I guess governments do and policymakers do. So I think leveraging that, I mean, that's something we've always have been doing, but really sort of strengthening them and empowering them to respond. They are much more in touch with issues at the grassroots. So we've really been working with SEVA and other organizations in India and Nepal. We found them to be much more reflective of the issue that's happening, and also much more agile in responding to them. So I think that's maybe could be something that we can sort of strengthen going forward as a way to respond to these kind of shocks. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Musna, for highlighting another aspect of community. that can be an effective way to look forward to our future policy directions. We have got two excellent questions from Mukesh and Sadman. Thank you very much for your questions. I can assure you that your answer would be sent to you. We are almost running out of time, so I will give it to Associate Professor Shahryar to conclude the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazmun. What a great webinar it has been. So I'd like to thank our speakers, Claudia, Derek, and Muzna, for your time and for your wonderful, insightful presentations on a very timely topic. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Nazmun, for moderating this event so nicely and smoothly. We really appreciate it. And we'd like to organize similar events with you. Thank you for your support. On 29th of July, we have organized another webinar on behalf of South Asia Research Network on the current financial crisis in Myanmar. I'll send you invitation, and I would hope that you'd be able to join with us. So with that, I'd like to conclude this event. Thank you very much. Thank you once again. See ya. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.